The moment I revealed I still owned our family's lakeside cabin, after being told I wasn't welcome at my son's wedding. His fiancée's champagne glass shattered on their marble floor. My name is Eleanor Winters, and for 45 years, I had quietly preserved our family's legacy property while my children believed it had been lost in my divorce settlement years ago. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. This photograph was taken almost 40 years ago. Me at 25, standing with my young son Michael, just 4 years old, outside our family's lakeside cabin in Pine Ridge. We were celebrating the last summer vacation before my divorce would be finalized. The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations, a place where I'd spent every childhood summer, and where I'd hoped my children and grandchildren would create their own memories. The worry in my eyes contrasts with the carefree smile on Michael's face. He was too young to understand that our family was about to change forever. My father built that cabin with his own hands in 1952, pouring his life savings and countless weekends into creating something that would outlast him. Eleanor, he told me while teaching me to fish off the dock, appearances can be deceiving, but ownership is truth. Never surrender what matters most, even when others think you have nothing left. That wisdom would prove prophetic decades later in ways neither of us could have imagined. I married young to Richard Winters, a charming corporate lawyer with impressive credentials and family connections. Our wedding was featured in the local society pages, the schoolteacher daughter of a construction foreman marrying into one of the city's established families. By the time our son turned 3, Richard's career had taken off, bringing wealth but also long absences and growing distance between us. "It's just one dinner, Eleanor," became his standard explanation for missed family moments. Eventually, those dinners included Stephanie, a junior partner at his firm. When I discovered their affair, the divorce that followed was bitter and public. Richard's powerful family used every legal advantage to minimize what I would receive in the settlement. The cabin is non-negotiable, Richard's attorney declared during mediation. The property was purchased during the marriage and is a significant asset that must be liquidated and divided. His voice carried the confidence of someone who had never lost a case against someone of my modest means. What no one knew then, what would remain my carefully guarded secret for decades, was that I had already secured the one thing that mattered most to me. 3 months before filing for divorce, sensing the marriage was beyond repair, I had quietly transferred ownership of the lakeside property to a small private trust established in my maiden name. The legal paperwork showed that the property had been sold to satisfy other debts, when in reality, I had preserved it beyond Richard's reach. My college roommate Sarah, now an estate attorney, had helped create the arrangement. "This isn't about deception, Eleanor," she assured me when I expressed doubts. "It's about protecting your family's legacy from someone who never truly valued it." "I'm sorry about the cabin, Eleanor," Richard said with manufactured sympathy after the divorce was finalized. "Some developer will probably tear it down anyway." I nodded silently, accepting his condolences for a loss that hadn't actually occurred, knowing that sometimes silence protects what matters most. In the difficult years that followed, I created a life for Michael and myself in a small apartment across town. I returned to teaching high school English, a career I had abandoned during my marriage at Richard's insistence. Money was tight, but we managed. The other teachers marveled at how I could stretch a modest salary, never knowing that a significant portion went toward property taxes and maintenance for a cabin they believed had been lost in my divorce. What my son never knew was that every summer while he visited his father's new family in Europe, I would spend 2 precious weeks at our family cabin, maintaining it quietly and preserving it for a future I hoped would one day include grandchildren, building sandcastles on the same shore where I had played as a child. "Mom, why don't we ever go to the lake anymore?" 10-year-old Michael asked once, remembering fragments of those early summers. "That's gone now, sweetheart," I replied, the half-truth bitter on my tongue. But we'll make new memories together. I justified the deception by promising myself that one day, when he was older and could understand, I would reveal everything and pass the cabin to him as my father had intended. As Michael grew older, he gradually absorbed his father's values and worldview. The summer visits to Europe became semester-abroad programs, and eventually an international business degree funded by Richard's family connections. During his college years, our phone conversations grew shorter and less frequent. When he did visit, he often glanced around my modest home with a mixture of embarrassment and pity. "You could do better than this, Mom," he once suggested after getting his first finance job. "I know some excellent financial advisors who could help you maximize your teacher's pension." The irony of his concern about my financial situation while I was secretly maintaining a valuable lakeside property was something I kept to myself, smiling and thanking him for his concern. I watched with a mixture of pride and concern as my son transformed from the curious, warm-hearted boy who had once collected pine cones at our cabin into a polished young professional who measured success in acquisitions and appearances. His girlfriend-turned-fiancée, Vanessa, accelerated this transformation. Coming from a family similar to Richard's, she viewed my teaching career and modest lifestyle as charming but ultimately limited. "Michael tells me you were quite the hostess. In your day," she commented during our first meeting, as though my life of substance and service existed only in some distant past. But I never could have anticipated how completely these values would come between us, or how the cabin I had secretly preserved would eventually become the centerpiece of a family confrontation that would change everything. The first real indication that Michael's fiancée viewed me as an inconvenience rather than family came during their engagement party at Richard's expansive lakefront estate, ironically just 20 miles down the shoreline from our family cabin. The invitation arrived on heavy cardstock, addressed formally to Mrs. Eleanor Winters, with a handwritten note from Vanessa. "We're keeping it intimate and sophisticated. No need to bring anything but yourself." The evening of the party, I wore a simple blue dress I'd purchased for the school's recent retirement ceremony, accessorized with my mother's pearl necklace, modest but appropriate. When I arrived at the sprawling mansion with its manicured grounds and valet parking, I immediately felt the distinction between my world and the one my son now inhabited. "Mom, you made it," Michael greeted me with a quick kiss on the cheek in the soaring marble foyer. His eyes darted over my outfit with a flicker of assessment before adding, "Vanessa's parents and their circle are by the main bar. Maybe you'd, be more comfortable on the garden terrace where it's quieter." This subtle redirection wasn't new. Over the 3 years of their relationship, I'd grown accustomed to being gently guided away from Vanessa's social circle. Sophisticated international travelers and finance professionals who viewed my career in public education with polite disinterest. What was new was Michael's growing comfort with this arrangement. Later that evening, I overheard my son speaking to an elegant older couple near the champagne fountain that dominated the center of the room. "Eleanor?" "Yes, my mother dedicated her life to teaching," he was explaining with the same tone he might use to describe an exotic but ultimately impractical lifestyle choice. "She's truly one of the unsung heroes, even if her world has been somewhat limited." "How admirable that she found fulfillment in such modest work," the woman replied, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she patted Michael's arm. "And how fortunate she must feel to see you achieve so much more." "We all follow different paths," Michael responded smoothly, raising his glass. "I'm just grateful I can ensure her comfort now that she's retired." The irony struck me deeply. This son who believed he needed to ensure my financial security had no idea that I owned a property worth more than his annual salary, maintained quietly through decades of careful planning and sacrifice. But the greater pain was hearing him describe my chosen profession, my deliberate life of service and substance, as though it were a charming limitation rather than a purposeful choice. These moments multiplied in the months that followed the engagement. Michael and Vanessa purchased a luxury condominium in the city's most exclusive high-rise, and my invitations to visit became increasingly rare and choreographed. When I did visit, Vanessa would make subtle remarks about my quaint perspectives or traditional tastes, each comment carrying the implication that I was a relic from another era, rather than a woman with her own valid viewpoint. "Michael mentions you never traveled much," she observed during one such visit, as we sat in their immaculate living room with its carefully curated art and spectacular city views. "We're planning to spend at least a month abroad every year. I can't imagine being so rooted." I smiled politely, thinking of the quiet mornings I'd spent watching mist rise off the lake at our cabin, the spectacular autumn colors reflected in those waters, the peace that comes from deeply knowing one. "Beloved place? Different kinds of richness, I suppose," was all I said, unwilling to defend my choices to someone uninterested in understanding them. My retiring from teaching after 32 years coincided with their wedding planning, and the intersection of these two significant life events revealed how completely Michael had adopted his father's value system. At my modest retirement gathering in the high school library, surrounded by colleagues and former students whose lives I had touched, Michael arrived late and left early, clearly uncomfortable in a setting so removed from the prestigious circles he now inhabited. "You could do so much more now, Mom," he suggested as we walked to the parking lot afterward. "Travel, take some courses at the community college, maybe even move to a nicer apartment in a better area." "I'm content with my life as it is," I replied. "Not everyone needs external validation to feel fulfilled." He frowned slightly, missing the gentle rebuke in my words. "It's not about validation, it's about quality of life. Dad mentioned he could help you with some investments if you're worried about your pension." The mention of Richard's offered help after decades of absence in our lives stung more than Michael could know. After the divorce, his father had consistently paid the required child support, but had otherwise remained distant, materializing primarily for graduations and other milestone events, where his presence would be noted by his social circle. That Michael now viewed his father as a financial authority to guide me felt like a particular betrayal. What my son couldn't understand, what I had never shared with him, was that through those 32 years of teaching, I had managed not only to maintain our secret family cabin, but had also built a modest but secure financial foundation. My pension, combined with careful investments guided by other teachers who had similar resourcefulness, provided everything I needed for the life I had chosen. The wedding planning brought these differences into sharper focus. Michael and Vanessa had selected an exclusive international resort for their ceremony, a location that would require significant travel expenses for me on my teacher's pension. When I gently inquired about the arrangements, suggesting a local celebration might allow more family to attend, the response was immediate and revealing. "This is about what Vanessa and I want for our special day," Michael explained, his tone suggesting I was being unreasonable. "Dad has already chartered a private jet for his side of the family." I nodded and assured him I would make it work, though the implied competition with Richard's extravagance was clear. What Michael didn't know was that I had already decided to use some of my carefully saved funds to attend his wedding with dignity, viewing it as an investment in our future relationship rather than an extravagance. 3 months before the wedding, Vanessa invited me to lunch at an upscale restaurant downtown, our first one-on-one meeting without Michael present. The invitation itself was unusual enough to put me on alert. "Eleanor," she began after the waiter had taken our orders, her voice carrying the practiced diplomacy of someone delivering a prepared speech. "I wanted to talk to you about the wedding arrangements." "Of course," I replied, maintaining a pleasant expression. "I've booked my flights and accommodations. Everything is set." "That's actually what I wanted to discuss." She toyed with her water glass, not quite meeting my eyes. "Michael and I have been finalizing the guest list, and we've realized that with his father bringing his extended family and business associates, and with my family's connections, The event has grown considerably in scope. I waited, sensing the real purpose of this meeting was yet to come. The thing is, she continued, her voice taking on a note of rehearsed concern, we're creating a very specific aesthetic for the weekend. The resort has a certain exclusivity that we're trying to maintain. We're concerned that you might feel uncomfortable among so many high-profile guests. I've attended many types of events in my life, Vanessa, I replied evenly. I'm quite capable of conducting myself appropriately in any setting. She offered a tight smile. Of course you are. That's not what I meant. She paused again. It's just that Michael's father is hosting a significant number of business connections who might be important to Michael's future. The dynamic could be complicated with you there, given the history. The real message became clear. My presence at my own son's wedding was seen as an inconvenience, a potential embarrassment, a complication to the image they wished to project. Are you suggesting I shouldn't attend my son's wedding? I asked directly, my voice calm despite the hurt blooming in my chest. Not at all, she replied quickly, though her eyes told a different story. We're just suggesting that perhaps you might be more comfortable celebrating with us when we return, in a more intimate setting. We could have a special dinner, just the three of us. The diplomatic language couldn't disguise what was happening. I was being uninvited from my only child's wedding. I see, I said finally, my mind already racing ahead to decisions that would need to be made. And does Michael share this perspective? Her hesitation told me everything. He understands the complexities of the situation. It was actually his father who pointed out how awkward the seating arrangements might be, and Michael agreed it might be best for everyone this way. In that moment, sitting across from this woman who would soon be my daughter-in-law, I realized that the cabin I had preserved through decades of sacrifice had taken on a new significance. What had begun as an effort to maintain a family legacy had now become a symbol of something more personal. My refusal to be erased from my own family's story. Please let Michael know I'd like to speak with him directly about this, I said as I gathered my purse to leave, the lunch barely touched. Some conversations shouldn't happen through intermediaries. As I drove home, a plan began to form. One that would force my son to confront not just my rightful place in his life, but the values he had abandoned in his pursuit of status and acceptance in a world that measured worth by appearance rather than substance. The cabin that had remained my secret for 40 years was about to become the centerpiece of a long overdue reckoning. The day after my lunch with Vanessa, I began what I privately termed my family recovery plan. Despite the hurt and anger churning, inside me, I felt a strange clarity of purpose. If my son and his fiancée believed they could simply write me out of his most important day, based on social appearances and Richard's comfort, then it was time to reconsider what would happen to the family legacy I had preserved for decades. My first call was to Sarah Thompson, my college roommate who had helped establish the private trust for the cabin 40 years earlier. Now a senior partner at her law firm specializing in estate planning, Sarah had maintained the legal structure of the trust through the decades, ensuring it remained protected and private. This is unexpected, she said when I explained the situation during our meeting in her downtown office. The space, with its leather-bound books and discreet wealth, reminded me of how different our professional paths had been, though our friendship had endured. You've maintained that trust specifically to pass the cabin to Michael someday. Are you certain you want to change that now? I'm not certain of anything yet, I admitted, smoothing my skirt as I gathered my thoughts. But I need to understand my options. If my son doesn't want me at his wedding, perhaps he doesn't want the family legacy either. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. Legally, your position is straightforward. The property has remained in the trust with you as the sole beneficiary and trustee. You have complete authority to determine its future. She paused, studying me with the insight of decades of friendship. But this isn't really about legal options, is it, Eleanor? This is about something deeper. It's about recognition, I said, after a moment. Not just of my legal rights to the property, but of my place in my son's life. If I'm not important enough to include in his wedding, why should he benefit from the sacrifices I've made to preserve something for his future? What exactly do you want to know? Sarah asked, her tone shifting to professional efficiency. First, I need to understand what Michael knows or believes about the cabin. Has Richard ever mentioned it over the years? Does Michael have any inkling that it still exists in our family? The questions had gnawed at me through a sleepless night. That would require some discreet investigation, Sarah noted. I can make inquiries through channels that won't raise suspicions. Second, I continued, I need to know my options for the property itself. Can I sell it? Donate it? What would those processes look like? Sarah made notes as we outlined a strategy. By the end of our meeting, she had agreed to conduct a quiet investigation into what Michael might know about the cabin, while I would visit the property to assess its current condition and value. 3 days later, I made the 2-hour drive to Pine Ridge. Though I visited yearly for maintenance, this trip felt different, weighted with purpose and the possibility of goodbye. The spring afternoon was perfect, sunlight dappling through pine trees as I turned onto the familiar gravel road. The cabin sat as it always had, its weathered cedar siding and green shutters a testament to my father's craftsmanship and my decades of care. Inside, everything remained as I had left it the previous summer. The handmade quilts folded neatly on beds, my father's fishing gear still hanging on the porch, photo albums documenting 4 generations of family gatherings carefully, preserved on bookshelves. I walked through each room, cataloging memories. Michael learning to swim off the dock at age 6. My father teaching me to make pancakes on the cast-iron stove. My mother's gentle voice reading poems on rainy afternoons. This wasn't just property. It was the physical embodiment of our family's history. The thought of strangers owning it created a physical ache in my chest. Yet the thought of gifting it to a son who didn't value my place in his life seemed equally painful. I spent the night at the cabin, sitting on the dock as stars reflected on the still lake, considering options I had never imagined would be necessary. By morning, I had reached a tentative decision, one that would require confirmation from Sarah's investigation. A week later, Sarah called with her findings. I've spoken with several sources, including Richard's former law partner who handled some of his estate planning, she explained. It appears Richard has maintained the narrative that the cabin was sold during your divorce. He's mentioned it occasionally to Michael, usually as an example of assets that needed to be liquidated during the settlement. So Michael believes it's long gone, I confirmed, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. Yes, Sarah continued, but there's more. According to my source, Michael and Vanessa have been looking at property in Pine Ridge for the past 6 months. Apparently, Richard mentioned that the old family cabin site would be coming up for sale soon, and he thought it would make an appropriate wedding gift if they could reclaim it for the family. The implications struck me immediately. Richard knows I still own the cabin? It seems likely, Sarah confirmed. Property records are public, though the trust structure obscures the connection to you. Someone with Richard's resources and legal connections could have discovered it. The timing suggests he may be planning to tell Michael after the wedding, presenting himself as the one who recovered the family property. The audacity was breathtaking. After 40 years, Richard had discovered my secret and was planning to use it for his own glory, recasting himself as the preserver of family legacy rather than the man who had tried to strip it away. There's one more thing, Sarah added hesitantly. According to my source, Vanessa has been explicit about her plans for the property if they acquire it. She intends to tear down the existing cabin and build a modern lake house more suitable for entertaining Richard's business associates. The final piece clicked into place. Not only was I being excluded from my son's wedding, but the family legacy I had preserved through decades of sacrifice was to be demolished and replaced with a showcase for the very values that had destroyed my marriage. "Thank you, Sarah," I said, my resolve hardening. "This clarifies exactly what needs to be done." Over the next 2 weeks, I methodically prepared for a confrontation I had never wanted but could no longer avoid. First, I gathered documentation, proving my continuous ownership of the cabin, trust documents, tax records, maintenance receipts spanning decades. Then I collected photographs chronicling my regular visits to the property, showing my careful preservation of every aspect my father had created. Most importantly, I prepared myself emotionally for what would likely be a painful reset of my relationship with my only child. The evidence suggested a level of calculation that couldn't be explained away as a simple misunderstanding. Michael had not only agreed to exclude me from his wedding, but was apparently planning to profit from Richard's discovery of property he believed had been lost to our family decades ago. The final element of my preparation was the most difficult. Working with Sarah, I drafted documents that would remove Michael as the eventual beneficiary of the trust. Instead, I established provisions to donate the property to the Pine Ridge Environmental Conservancy upon my death, ensuring it would be preserved in its natural state rather than developed. The irrevocable nature of these documents meant that once signed, this decision could not be undone, a finality that weighed heavily as I considered the implications. "Are you absolutely certain this is what you want?" Sarah asked as she slid the papers across her desk. "Once executed, these documents permanently change the succession plan for the property." I hesitated, pen poised above the signature line. "I've spent 40 years preserving this cabin for a son who now finds me too embarrassing to include in his wedding," I said finally. "I need him to understand that family legacy isn't something you can dismiss when inconvenient and reclaim when advantageous. And if he reacts with genuine remorse, if this serves as the wake-up call you hope it might be?" I considered this possibility, which represented my deepest hope, that confronting these truths might somehow reclaim the son I had raised before Richard's values had reshaped him. "Let's add a contingency clause," I decided. "The donation doesn't become irrevocable until either my death or 1 year from the date of notification to Michael, whichever comes later. That gives him time to demonstrate whether his values can still align with what this property represents." Sarah nodded approvingly as she made the notation. A door left slightly open. Wise as always, Eleanor. The following weekend, Michael called to invite me to dinner at his condominium, a rare occurrence that immediately raised my suspicions, given the recent conversation with Vanessa. His voice carried the forced casualness of someone with a prepared agenda. "Just a small gathering." "With Vanessa and me," he explained. "We have some wedding updates to discuss with you." "How thoughtful," I replied, matching his light tone while suspecting the updates would formalize my exclusion from the event. "Saturday at 7 works perfectly for me." This dinner would provide the setting for a confrontation that neither Michael nor Vanessa could possibly anticipate. As I prepared for the evening, selecting a simple but elegant outfit and gathering the documentation I would need, I felt a strange calm despite the emotional magnitude of what was to come. In my purse, I placed 3 items: the formal notification of changes to the trust beneficiary, recent photographs of the cabin showing my continued maintenance, and most significantly, the deed proving my uninterrupted ownership across 4 decades. These papers represented not just legal ownership of property, but the revelation of a truth I had protected longer than my son had been alive. Saturday evening arrived with perfect spring weather, the kind that had always made the lake at Pine Ridge shimmer like polished glass. As I drove to Michael's condominium in the exclusive River Point Tower, I rehearsed what I would say when the moment came. Not accusations or recriminations, but simple truths that had remained unspoken for too long. When Michael greeted me at the door with a kiss that barely grazed my cheek, I noticed immediately that the dining table was set for 3 and a bottle of expensive champagne chilled in a silver bucket. Whatever wedding updates they planned to share apparently warranted celebration. Perhaps the formalization of my exclusion had been deemed worthy of toasting. "Mom, you look nice," Michael commented, his eyes briefly assessing my simple navy dress and pearl earrings. The subtle surprise in his tone suggested he had expected less, another small indication of how completely he had misunderstood who I was and what I valued. "Thank you," I replied with a warm smile that revealed nothing of my purpose. "I'm looking forward to hearing your wedding updates." As I took the seat offered at their glass dining table with its spectacular city view, I couldn't help but think of the rough-hewn wooden table at the cabin where 4 generations of our family had gathered. The contrast between these settings, one designed to impress visitors, the other to nurture connection, seemed suddenly to represent everything that had gone wrong between my son and me. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen, carrying an artfully arranged platter of appetizers that looked more decorative than substantial. "Eleanor, so glad you could join us," she said with practiced charm that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We have some exciting developments to share about the wedding. Plans." As she poured champagne into delicate flutes, I prepared myself for the conversation that would change everything between us. The cabin I had protected for 40 years was about to emerge from the shadows, forcing a long overdue reckoning with the values that truly mattered in creating a legacy worth preserving. "A toast," Michael declared, raising his champagne flute as we settled at the dining table with its panoramic view of the city lights below, "to new beginnings and family traditions." The irony of his chosen words was not lost on me as I gently touched my glass to theirs. Vanessa's smile remained fixed as she took a delicate sip, her eyes already gleaming with the news they were clearly eager to share. "Mom," Michael began, setting down his glass with a practiced precision that reminded me painfully of Richard. "We wanted to talk to you about some adjustments to our wedding plans." I nodded encouragingly, allowing them to proceed with the script. They had obviously prepared. My own revelation could wait until they had fully committed to theirs. "As you know, the resort in Santorini is exclusive and intimate," he continued. "We've had to make some difficult decisions about the guest list to accommodate key business associates of Dad's who can open doors for my career." Vanessa leaned forward, her expression a studied blend of concern and determination. "What Michael is trying to say, Eleanor, is that we've had to reconsider some of the arrangements. The dynamics with Richard's family and business connections create certain complexities." "You're uninviting me to the wedding," I stated calmly, deciding to spare them the elaborate justifications they had prepared. "Vanessa already explained this at lunch last week." Michael's expression flickered with surprise before settling into something between embarrassment and relief. "It's not uninviting, Mom. It's recognizing that the situation might be uncomfortable for everyone. We're thinking of your comfort, too." "My comfort," I repeated softly. "Exactly," Vanessa interjected, apparently missing the skepticism in my tone. "Dad has been working on something special. A surprise, really. We weren't supposed to tell you yet, but under the circumstances." He glanced at Vanessa, who nodded encouragingly. "Dad has located our old family cabin at Pine Ridge," he announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of delivering remarkable news. "The one that was sold during your divorce. He's negotiating to buy it back as our wedding gift. Isn't that incredible? We're planning to rebuild it as a modern lake house where we can create new family memories." "Tear it down and rebuild," Vanessa clarified, her excitement evident. "The existing structure is charming but dated. We're working with an architect who specializes in luxury lake properties." I took a slow sip of champagne, using those seconds to compose myself before responding. The audacity of their plan, presented as a gift to me when they were literally replacing everything my father had built, was breathtaking. That's certainly unexpected, I managed, placing my glass carefully on the table. May I ask when? Richard discovered this property was available? Michael looked momentarily confused by my focus on this detail. A few months ago, I think. He has connections in real estate who keep an eye out for opportunities. Why does that matter? It's just interesting timing, I observed. And Richard is certain this is the same property? The original family cabin? Absolutely, Michael confirmed. He showed me the listing photos. It looks exactly like I remember from when I was little, just more weathered. The stone fireplace, the green shutters. It's definitely our old place. The interior needs to be completely gutted, of course, Vanessa added with a dismissive wave. But the location is perfect. Private waterfront, mature trees. Once we replace the cabin with something more suitable, it will be incredible. I nodded. Thoughtfully, my hand moving to my purse where the documents waited. And this generous gift? This is meant as a consolation for not attending your wedding? Michael had the grace to look uncomfortable. That's not how I'd put it, Mom. It's about creating something positive, focusing on the future instead of my presence at my only child's wedding, I completed for him. An awkward silence fell over the table. Vanessa busied herself, rearranging an already perfect place setting, while Michael struggled visibly with how to proceed. Mom? He finally said, his tone shifting to the patient voice one might use with a difficult child. We're trying to make the best of a complicated situation. Dad's extended family will be there, his business associates, Vanessa's family connections, people who are important to our future. The potential for awkwardness is significant. More significant than the absence of your mother, I noted, not as a question but as a simple statement of their apparent priorities. That's not fair, Michael protested, a flash of the boy I had, raised briefly visible beneath the polished exterior. We're offering an alternative that honors family legacy while avoiding social complications. The moment had arrived. I reached for my purse and removed the envelope containing the cabin documentation, placing it on the table between us. Before we discuss alternatives further, I said evenly, there's something you should know about the family cabin at Pine Ridge. Michael's expression registered confusion as I slid the envelope toward him. What about it? Open this, I instructed. Gently. He hesitated briefly before reaching for the envelope, removing the contents with the careful precision that characterized so many of his movements now. I watched as he examined the first document. The original deed showing the creation of the Eleanor Jameson Trust, named for my maiden name, dated 3 months before my divorce from Richard was finalized. His brow furrowed as he turned to the second document, continuous property tax receipts spanning 40 years, all paid by the same trust. The third document showed regular maintenance expenses, a new roof in 1989, updated plumbing in 1998, electrical work in 2007, all carefully preserved in my records. Finally, he reached the photographs, recent images showing the cabin in excellent condition with subtle evidence of my continued presence. A book on the side table that I had been reading the previous summer. Fresh curtains I had sewn to replace ones damaged by sun exposure. The garden shed my father had built, now repainted in the same forest green he had originally chosen. I don't understand, Michael said finally, looking up from the documents with genuine confusion. These look like... Mom, are you saying you've owned the cabin all this time? Yes, I confirmed simply. I never lost it in the divorce. I created a private trust to protect it before the proceedings began. For 40 years, I've maintained it, preserved it, and kept it exactly as your grandfather built it, while allowing you and your father to believe it had been sold. Vanessa's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor. Neither of us moved to clean up the spill as she stared at me with undisguised shock. That's not possible, Michael insisted, shuffling through the documents. again as if searching for evidence that would disprove my claim. Dad said it was sold as part of the settlement. He's been negotiating to buy it back. Your father discovered the trust about 6 months ago, I explained. His real estate connections likely noticed the similarity between the trust name and my maiden name. Rather than approach me directly, he apparently developed this plan to recover it as a grand gesture, after tearing down everything your grandfather built, of course. Michael's expression cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally, the dawning realization that everything he had believed about the cabin, and perhaps about me, had been built on assumptions that were now crumbling. "Why would you keep this secret?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "All these years, why didn't you tell me?" It was the question I had anticipated, the one I had spent sleepless nights preparing to answer. Yet now, facing my son across, a table scattered with evidence of my decades-long deception, I found myself searching for the right words. At first, it was about protection. I began carefully. The cabin was my family's legacy, something your grandfather built with his own hands. The divorce was bitter, and your father's legal team was determined to claim everything of value. Creating the trust was the only way to preserve what mattered most to me. The direct